am incredibly privileged to be moderating this panel. We have 7 absolutely wonderful panelists, which makes me worried already that we are going to run into the same challenge as all the other panels with timing. But I will do my best to make sure we do what we can to really bring on the wealth of experience and insights that are directly relevant to the set of issues that we're discussing. And as I think we already saw with the last panel, while the Gilson and Gordon model of Board 3.0 is nominally the focal point of this conversation, we are really having the privilege of using that model as a way of thinking through what insights we can learn from private equity governance, but also what insights we can use from other areas to rethink and reimagine the possibilities of public company board governance. I cannot imagine a better group of panelists to help us with these questions. I will briefly introduce each when I ask them in opening a question. That said, they each have experience that goes well beyond what I'm going to be able to summarize. So I will encourage you to click on their bios and read more about the range of experiences they have that are informing their comments this morning. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and kick it off. And I want to start with Les Brun. Les is the CEO of SAR Group. He was a managing director, head of investor relations at CCMP Capital Advisors, and founder of the private equity advisory and management firm Millstein. He also serves on a number of different board of directors. And that's where I want us to start today's conversation. So among your current roles, Les, you are chairman of Broadridge Financial Solutions Incorporated and CDK Global Incorporated. You are the lead director at Merck, and you serve on the board of directors of Corning and NXT Capital. And so you are in some ways the embodiment of Board 2.0. And so I'd love if you could use your experience in those various settings to tell us a little bit about what you see as strengths and weaknesses in the current model. And in particular, one of the claims that is underlying Jeff and Ron's current view is that current public company boards are thinly informed, under-resourced, and boundedly motivated, to quote from their work. And really that's just trying to say, let's focus on, do you have the information that you need to do the job before you? Do you feel like you have the resources you need to do the job before you? And how do you think about the incentives that you and your fellow directors bring to serving on the boards in which you currently serve?
That's a very profound and multidimensional question, Kate, but I'll give it my best. And I'd like to think of myself as perhaps board 2.75 maybe, or board 2.8. I have the privilege of having the benefit of a private equity experience and a public board experience. And I think of boards as having evolved quite a bit, largely driven by Sarbox and Dodd-Frank, but Sarbox in particular. When I first joined the public company board, I was astounded at how ill-informed and how little desire there was for more information on the part of my fellow board members. I was at ADP. And it was astounding to me that very little was being thought of as important enough to challenge management or to develop an independent point of view. I think board members have gotten much more keen about their obligation to learn more about the company, to better insinuate themselves into an understanding of the company's dynamics and the marketplace in which the company operates. But I do think that we are at a disadvantage as independent Board 2.0 model members, because unlike our private equity brethren who typically govern boards, I think of it in 3 distinct buckets. I think of it as collegial, collaborative, and directive, and depending how the company is doing and where the company is in its development, you can either be collegial and just get together every now and then and pat yourselves on the back about how great the company is doing. Collaborative is when you've got a younger management team and there's more involvement on the part of the board, greater insights and greater access to information and data than would be in a public company setting. And then directive is where things are not going well, and that board is, since they're the owners as well, is telling that management exactly what to do. You don't have that opportunity in the public board setting. right? So in the public board context, you do have to educate yourself independently better about the company. Where I see the distinction in the public company board in terms of 2.0 versus 3.0 is with activists and how companies deal with activists. And if you think about the typical activist, that activist has the opportunity to spend an extraordinary amount of money in developing their investment thesis around whatever company they're engaged with. So they'll spend the money to hire the consulting firms, they'll spend the money to hire the accounting firms, they'll spend the money to hire the law firms to do an extraordinary legal review. So when that activist director shows up at a board meeting, they're infinitely better prepared, having had the benefit of far greater resources than the typical public board member does. And we have to find a way to sort of evolve to something closer to that activist member. How that happens is going to be driven by each independent board, because we all have the opportunity to demand greater levels of resources from the companies on whose boards we sit in order to exercise the functions that we've been charged with exercising. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that frames the conversation a little bit.
I'm now going to turn to Steve Fraden, who's currently a partner at Cadwalader. He was described recently in American Lawyer magazine as an M&A legend with decades of deal-making experience and who has entered the SPAC world with a splash. And of course, the entering the SPAC world with a splash was a reference to his being named the 2021 Dealmaker of the Year for the role that he played with the launch of Pershing Square Tontine Holdings. And so, Steve, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the structure of Tontine with a particular focus on governance and how you thought about and potentially sought to address some of the issues that we've been talking about over the course of this conversation in terms of motivation, in terms of information, and in terms of resources that are available to the board.
Right, thank you, Kate. Let me first point out a couple of, I think, important factors about Pershing Square Tontine things. I'm going to call it PSTH because we don't have enough time for me to keep repeating the full name of the company. But number one, it is a public company. So unlike the private equity model that Ron and Jeff have been talking about, this is a public company with all of the factors that are relevant to a public company. And in particular, I think that the board 2.0 for public companies has been driven to a large extent by lawyers. Lawyers who are concerned about protecting the board members from legal liability. I think that is a significantly excessive concern. The number of board members who have been personally liable is incredibly small, and the amounts are incredibly small. And so to some extent, what lawyers do is self-serving. They're saying to the boards, look, you're at unbelievable risk, and you really need me to help you deal with that risk. And so I'm going to help you deal with the risk by creating a whole lot of very highly articulated processes that will protect you, even if you get it wrong. One of the interesting things about the examples that Ron and Jeff have used about what they've described as board failures, the JP Morgan whale, the Wells Fargo situation, the two generals, General Electric, General Motors, is that directors may have been inattentive, they may not have been inattentive, they may have been ineffective, they may not have been ineffective, but they weren't liable. And so the structuring of boards and board processes to avoid liability is something that I think has been done to excess. The second observation I would make about PSTH is that the company that is designed to engage in an acquisition. And I would argue that the best example of board 3.0 is a board of directors that's dealing with an M&A situation. Under those circumstances, the board is thickly informed. The board hires investment bankers. They hire lawyers who are sophisticated in those kinds of transactions. There is a substantial amount of information provided to the board. The board has an opportunity to interact with these experts and with management. And the board decisions, at least in my experience, are really richly informed. They're well motivated, and whether they're right or not, they're at least the kinds of judgments that I think Ron and Jeff have been talking about. So when you look at PSTH, it's a board for a public company that's designed to engage in a merger and acquisition transaction. The third observation I would make about PSTH is, and this is something that, it's inescapable, is that the selection of directors, which was largely done by the sponsor of the SPAC, which is Pershing Square, has been very skillful. So the people on the board are incredibly high quality people, and not all directors are that high quality. It's as if one were to say, well, Steve, you play tennis, so you must be like Roger Federer, and Lord knows I'm not. The fact is that if you put on a board Mike Ovitz and Joe Steinberg, who's the head of Jefferies and Company, and Lisa Gersh and Jackie Reeses and Bill Ackman, you're going to get a board that will be thickly informed, because these are people who have high intellect and a lot of energy and don't take no for an answer. You're going to get well-motivated people, because we structured the compensation in a way to motivate them. And you're going to get people who will really function like the best of the private equity boards. And this is a public company. They're sophisticated enough to understand that they will be protected from liability by being careful and honest and diligent. So I think that's going to work very well, but in some respects, it's a very peculiar example of a public company, because it is a company that is designed to do the very thing that I think boards do best, which is merger and acquisition analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really nice framing. It partly gets us focused on not only that heterogeneity across different types of firms, but heterogeneity in the needs of firms at different points in time. And SPACs just happen to bring those two into one. And with that, I want to turn to our next panelist, Sandra Weinberg. She is an executive advisor to Aquiline, and she serves on the board of directors of Cognizant, T. Rowe Price, and Automatic Data Processing, in addition to having served a range of other board and executive roles. And Sandra, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of committees. You currently chair a number of committees, you were on a number of committees, and Steve nicely just set up the fact that there's certain periods of time where directors become more thickly informed because of the nature of the transaction that they are facing. And committees are another mechanism where we try to say that we're going to choose a small subset of the board to become much more thickly informed and much more engaged and perhaps more resourced when tackling particular types of challenges. And so I was wondering if you could speak at all to the role of committees and perhaps bridging some of the differences between the board 2.0 and board 3.0 model.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I enjoyed listening to the prior panel and so far Les and Steve's comments. I told Jeff when we had our pre-call that one of the boards that informs point of view about life as a board member was joining the Tyco International Board in 2003. And I served there for almost 14 years. And to me, it was way ahead of its time in terms of board evolution and governance. We brought in a whole new board. We changed out, I think, something like 200 out of the top 300 management, obviously working with the senior team to do so. We split up the company 3 ways twice, and we ultimately merged it with JCI. And that was my first board. So it was like, going to graduate school in board governance, because it was a great story and developed a lot of shareholder value. When you think about committees, I think that the committees are actually quite essential. But before I get to that, I wanted to say that a lot of the magic or the secret sauce is on the composition of the board, as Steve said, and the culture of the board. And the culture of the board enables committees to operate effectively because the culture has to be engaged, proactive, embrace constructive conflict. Otherwise, committees can't go do their work and come back and report to the rest of the board some of the decisions and recommendations that they might have. I think in Jeff's analysis, they talked about sort of the needs to do certain things, both to become thickly informed and better resourced. I would argue that good governance, the board is setting the agenda, not management. I think that was one of the criticisms that Jeff and Ron had, and committees help with that, definitely. One question that you had, Kate, in the pre message to us all was, are we too focused on compliance? Well, I chair a couple of audit committees, and I would say what has migrated in audit committees and gone to the full board is really from compliance to enterprise risk management. And enterprise risk management is a framework that involves strategy, ops, finance, IT, talent, and legal and compliance, by the way. But all of those other risks and how they impact the business model are really germane to not just what's happening at the audit committee, but also influencing the agendas of all the other committees as well, and the full board. Many boards have a strategy finance committee, which really digs deep and gets into issues that perhaps there isn't otherwise time at the full board. And that's a very important committee to have for many companies. Sometimes you'll see a technology committee if that's germane to what's happening to the strategy of the company as well. We at all of my boards have very deep dives already on all sorts of topics. Usually the deep dives are linked back to the enterprise risk management framework. So the ERM framework will identify key areas of enterprise risk, and then there'll be deep dives around that. And risk is not about the avoidance of risk, by the way, it's about the management of risk. And the best performing boards and committees will say enterprise risk is really like the guardrails on the highway. If we have good guardrails, we can drive the car even faster than if we didn't have them. Committees also in their charters have the ability to access external resources. And the best committees take advantage of that, seeking help and guidance from outsiders without being in the middle of a crisis or an M&A transaction. And also have the ability to help drive resources internally in the company as well for special projects and initiatives. The other thing that committees are very important for, but also the full board does this, is engaging with talent below the C-suite, which is really, really important to understand what's going on in the company. You're usually doing so without the CEO in the room. And some of the boards I'm on, we actually have meetings with next gen talent without any member of the C-suite, on the phone or in the room or on the Zoom or whatever mechanism we're able to use. And that's really important because a huge issue for everybody right now is having a deep focus on talent and the pipeline of talent. And then committees also play a really important role in engaging with shareholders, not just during proxy season, but outside of proxy season. As an audit chair, I've had a number of conversations with our shareholders around a variety of different topics. Nom and Gov chair also does that. The comp committee chair also does that, and the lead director does that too. So those are some of the ways in which I think the committee structure really does create a more thickly informed board and also helps with the resource question.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that really helps flush out the current ecosystem as we think about trying to shift that ecosystem, or whether we should or shouldn't make that type of shift. Ed, could I confirm that you are on the phone right now?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so let me introduce you quickly. So our next panelist is joining us by phone. We have Ed Rock, who's currently the Martin Lipton Professor of Law at NYU, as well as the co-director of the Institute for Corporate Governance and Finance at NYU Law School. Along with Ron and Jeff, he has been a long-time leading scholar on the issues that we've been talking about today. And I would like to invite you to talk a little bit about how some of the work that you have done relates to these ideas. And in particular, you've written about validation capital. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how Board 3.0 fits with validation capital. How is it similar? How is it different? And how does it inform the way you think about today's conversation?
I'd be glad to, Kate. Thanks to you, and thanks to Ron and Jeff for inviting me to participate in this really interesting conference. Let me start by saying that no good ideas are new ideas. In 1972, Arthur Goldberg was invited to go on the board of TWA. And famously, Arthur Goldberg said he would, but he would only do so if also resources to hire a staff to help him become informed and to serve as a director. TWA declined the opportunity, and Arthur Goldberg did not go on the board. And in many respects, this Arthur Goldberg model is a precursor to this notion of directors being thickly informed, well-resourced, and well incentivized. There seem to me to be two questions. One is making the right decision for the company, choosing the right strategy. And the second is communicating with the markets. On the first, we know that the locus of strategic decision-making is in the executive suite. What in a two-board, in a two-level system like Germany is known as the managing or the management board. And that, of course, is very well resourced, very well informed, with very good incentives. The function that the board, I think, in our system plays, and the board in Board 3.0 plays, in Jeff and Ron's model, is much more about being able to credibly communicate to the shareholders in particular and to the markets in general. As Christina pointed out so sharply on the last panel, the world of publicly held companies is incredibly heterogeneous, running from micro cap to small cap to big cap to large cap to very large cap. And the current model of board governance, Board 2.0, is hardly unitary. Probably best as a description of the large and very large cap companies, and that any new model for board governance will have to be very sensitive to the heterogeneity of the universe of companies. In moving in that direction, one approach is to sort of start with models that work, and then think about whether they could be scaled. And it's in that context, it seems to me that what has come to be known as validation capital is very, very interesting. The stories are the illustration. So famously, Tryon took a large position at BNY Mellon without any permission. They just went into the market and bought a couple of $1 billion worth of stock at BNY Mellon. And of course, had a whole theory about what BNY Mellon needed to do in order to be best in class. Upon finding out that Tryon was a shareholder, Gerald Hassel, the CEO, began to talk with Tryon, and a conversation developed. And eventually, Ed Garden, one of the partners at Tryon, went on the board at BNY Mellon, having talked extensively with management about their strategy and about what Tryon thought the optimal strategy would be. And then later, when Marcato, a hedge fund, showed up and said BNY Mellon is underperforming and what it needs to do is fire Gerald Hassel and do a variety of other things. When Tryon said, no, actually, we don't think that is right. We've been deeply involved in the company. We have $2 billion or $3 billion of our own money at stake. We think that the current strategy is the winning strategy, and we just need to implement it. That, of course, took the wind out of the sails of Marcato, and they made no headway with the other shareholders, in particular, no headway with the decisive shareholders, namely the largest asset managers, some of whom are with us here today. That model has come to be known as validation capital. Value Act has done this successfully in a number of circumstances. It did it at Microsoft. It was invited in at Seagate to play that role. And that's a role that is a very good example of thickly informed, well-resourced, and well-incentivized directors who have their thickly resourced, well-funded is their staff back at the home office that can review data and review the strategy. The problem, of course, is that there are not a lot of try-ons and value acts around. The situations at companies where that is the appropriate strategy is relatively limited because they are only going to get involved if there is a substantial upside. And the number of management teams that are open to that sort of partnership is also limited. And I think it should be pointed out that neither at BNY Mellon nor at Microsoft when Value Act showed up, in neither case was the outside investor invited. And quite clearly, in neither case were they particularly welcome. It ended up working out very well. But part of what made them such credible validators of management strategy was their independence. They had arrived without any sort of a pre-negotiation with management. In the paper that I've done with Dorothy Lund and Alon Brav, we drilled down on valuation capital to see if we could find a dark side, to find a situation where it could be used for management entrenchment rather than as a objective validation of management strategy. And we were not able to find it. And I think the reasons we couldn't find it are really instructive and instructive for Board 3.0 going forward. It is a combination of disclosure and governance. The disclosure piece is that any sort of side payments that would be made to a potentially corrupt provider validation capital would have to be disclosed. And that very disclosure would make them much less credible at the point that they go to the market and they say that management strategy should be supported. And so the dynamics of the market where the purveyor of validation capital does not itself have sufficient resources to provide sufficient capital to insulate management, but can only play an intermediary role in convincing the market also I think gives us reason to believe that the corrupt forms, if they exist, will be extraordinarily rare. The question, as I say earlier, is can this be scaled? Can one move from the Tryon Value Act model to a model where you have a skilled director, a director with market credibility, but who doesn't have the same stake in the company, that doesn't have the amount at stake or the resources at the home office to provide the support? Can that be scaled in the Arthur Goldberg sort of way? What does it look like to say to an outside director, you get to hire McKinsey to advise you, while the management team is getting their advice from somebody else? And let me stop there.
Thank you. Wonderful contributions. And with that, we are now going to move back to our practitioners who are coming to this with more industry experience. And we're going to move to Yvonne Hogue, who's managing director, co-founder, and operating advisor at the private equity firm Cove Hill Partners. She has spent her career in strategic operating roles within the consumer technology and private equity industries. And Yvonne, one of the big conversations that is happening in the background is how much effort is going into compliance and oversight relative to the strategic and operational decisions that a firm really needs to ultimately succeed. And you've been involved in a number of companies that have to be simultaneously engaged in both of these conversations and have managed to oftentimes be quite successful. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that balance and how that informs our conversation.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks especially to Jeff and Ron for putting together this conference. Board governance is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I've had the chance to serve on public company boards, private company boards, nonprofit boards, and I've also been an operator, having to be on the other side of working with boards. So to answer your question, Kate, I think, the points that Jeff and Ron make, I think is true, which is that what I found in public company boards is that by necessity, there's just a lot more time spent on having to go through, compliance and all the formal processes. And, as someone mentioned, I think in this panel and the other ones too, around just all of the legal regulatory pieces of it. I think all of that is good and it's important and it serves a function, but it does take up a bunch of time. So one thing that I've seen public companies boards do to kind of get around that, to make sure that there's still enough time for strategy, which I think is the most important place a board can, have an impact, is to create dedicated strategy sessions. So, for example, on the public company board I'm on right now, we had our board meeting yesterday, and we've set aside our next board meeting will be in person, hallelujah, again, which is awesome. But we're actually having an extra day added to that board meeting to focus just on long-term strategy so that we can get, the normal board and committee work done and then set time aside for that. So that I think is more similar to what you see in private equity boards, where because in a private equity setting, you don't have a lot of those same committees, or you don't have a lot of the same compliance. Pretty much the entire board meeting is dedicated to strategy, execution, organization, capital structure, M&A, kind of all of the meaty stuff. And that is kind of, where you see a lot of the value. The one other thing maybe I'll comment on is just in listening to this conversation is that I think it's interesting. I mean, there's not, having been on a variety of different types of boards, I think there's a lot of nuance. I think what Sandra said is right, which is it's a collection of a handful of people. And so even changing out a couple people or changing out, how you set the agenda really makes a big difference. And there's not a kind of standard paintbrush I'd use. So for example, someone in the last panel said, well, private equity is all about financial engineering. That's the only thing the boards care about. I've been at Bain Capital for a long time with Brian, and I've now at Cove Hill. That is definitely not, we spend all of our time thinking about what are the 2 or 3 big strategic opportunities that are going to really move the needle and create value for this company. We talk a lot about talent, a lot about operations. So I think it's hard to make kind of one brushstroke. The other thing I would say is, and I've had this discussion with Jeff a bit, there are many things about a private equity model that are appealing. But again, there's a wide range of private equity firms. And so I've seen some private equity board members be probably very unhelpful in terms of being overreaching and micromanaging and telling the management team what to do in a very distracting, demoralizing way. I've also seen private equity firms who said, okay, you hit your numbers, we don't need to have a board meeting. Or, I'm in the board meeting, but if you're doing fine, I'm going to be doing my email separately. And so that's probably not that helpful either. So I would say that we should be careful when we talk about these things to kind of paint things with a broad brush and to be much more thoughtful about the specific aspects that are useful or not useful. And I think there are certainly things about the private equity model that are useful that can be ported into public company settings and vice versa. The one other last thing I'll say that hasn't been talked about in this panel or the previous one is what it feels like to be an operator. So I've been a CEO and a COO and a CFO, having to work with boards. And I think, running a company is a lot of work. You're kind of in the day-to-day guts of like dealing with all kinds of crises, customers, employees. You're trying to hit your numbers. You're trying to focus on strategy. And then you have the board meeting. And so the discussion I've had with my executive teams is like, we have to have a board anyways. So we should try to make it a good board, just like we should try to make our customer service team a great customer service team, et cetera. And that requires intentionality to it. And what you don't want is you don't want to have a board meeting that your executive team puts all this work into it, and then you show up, and then the board just kind of doesn't pay attention, or they're really, really negative and kind of pull you in a million directions, and you leave that meeting and you're exhausted and you're really kind of sucked of energy. It's kind of call it the vampire, effect. What you really want is a board that has your back, and they're there to support you and challenge you, to offer different perspectives, maybe to disagree with you, to push you. But at the end of the day, they're there to try to be helpful. And that dynamic of trust and transparency and openness is really important, I think, on both sides. So with that, Kate, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful in our further efforts to flush out the ecosystems across these different areas and try to think about some of the nuances that matter an incredible amount when you're actually shifting towards execution. And I particularly appreciate the discussion of things like adding a day on. It complements Sandra's conversation of the committees of how do we actually bridge? It actually gets back to Les's point of like 2.75. Like how do we figure out the blended model that works, and how do you structure that in a particular setting? And with that, I want to move to your former colleague, Brian Murphy, who again is coming to us. He has been currently is the managing director at BRG. He has been the primary operating executive in over 20 private equity investments, partnering with management and private equity deal teams to establish post-investment strategy, pursue performance improvement, and install strong governance. So Brian, we would love to hear a little bit more from you, kind of building on the conversation that we were just having with Yvonne. What is it you see as the particular strengths of the private equity model? How much of that is really tied to the nature, the finite nature of the investment, the controlling nature that's frequently the case in the investment, and how much of it could effectively be ported over to the very different public company setting?
Yes, great. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me the privilege of being part of a very esteemed panel. I'm sure I'm the dumbest because I know Yvonne is way smarter than I am. I think Yvonne made a good point, which is you can't paint private equity or private equity boards, even within private equity firms, kind of with one paintbrush, because I've seen all flavors. I think I'll describe a little bit of the best of and maybe the worst of at the same time. You know, the best. The thing you're really trying to do in private equity investment, and partly my job as an operating partner, so a bridge between, if you say, between the management team and the PE board. Sometimes I would sit on the board, sometimes I wouldn't, but I was always in the role of spending a lot of time with the management team. You were trying to get alignment on what the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that you were trying to do. The more things you had on that list, the harder that alignment was to get. And if you could get that alignment and then create transparency around the conversation and also solve the talent problem, the people problem, which is really at the essence of most private equity investments, you could have a fairly good discussion week to week, month to month, and at the board meetings. And part of my job was to create what I used to say with a moving picture as opposed to a quarterly snapshot, because that moving picture, the kind of understanding what's going on in the daily lives of the management team, both good and bad, allowed you to make much quicker decisions and get to your goals faster. And in private equity, ultimately, your IRR is determined by how quickly you make the investment work. In the worst situations, you didn't have that alignment. You had board meetings with too many people, with too many ideas, all good, all smart people giving lots of great ideas to the management team, which they couldn't field, lots of preparation. They would just, at the end of the board meeting, they would thank the Lord that they were leaving, that the board had left and that they could get back to their daily lives, but there was no connectivity between what the conversation was and what they were doing. In the good situations, that strategy discussion that Yvonne described that lasted a day or maybe even a day and a half helped them make decisions and help the board understand where some of the money needed to be spent, frankly. So again, I've seen boards with lots of outsiders. I think that can be good because it can bring lots of good opinions. It does put pressure on the CEO because there's lots of people now to talk to and prepare and pre-wire for the board meetings. I've seen very small boards, which can be very efficient, but very myopic. So there's always a little bit of a balancing act that you have to have. I think public boards, which I don't have as much experience with, can learn from some of the methodologies that private equity uses. I think keeping people informed. I think some of the good boards where there's been lots of people on them, you've given board members specific opportunities that play to their expertise. So if you have a consumer expert from McKinsey on your board, make sure that they're working with your marketing department and are very involved in that. Don't spread them like peanut butter across the investment. If you have someone who understands the supply chain, make sure that they're focusing with your supply chain people. But give them work to do so that they feel involved and also feel valued by the management team and the rest of the board. I would say that it'll be interesting to see with the rise of the SPACs, right? So we talked about pipes and some of the experience there and some of the post, once the private equity does the IPO, they often stay involved quite a number of years. And so you have private equity involvement with the board. I think SPACs and the emergence of SPACs and then the de-SPACing process that's going on are going to create some very interesting board situations in public companies. As private equity is looking to SPACs for exit opportunities, there's been a number of them. They again will stay on the board because they won't be able to exit for several cycles. You'll have the professional managers, hopefully from the SPAC themselves, who hopefully won't trade out. And you'll have kind of an interesting group of board members that will carry some of these investments forward. And I'm sure some will be great. I'm sure some won't be that great, but it'll be, I think, an interesting experiment for Ron and Jeff's hypothesis theory here. I'll pause there. I think I think it's already been said in a large public company setting. I'm not 100% convinced CEOs would accept it. The downside of being a public CEO is the public scrutiny. The downside of being a private equity CEO is the kind of intense scrutiny. And if you have both of those things, I'm not sure that many of my business school buddies who become CEOs would love that. Yvonne could probably comment better. And then I think the market credibility, which is the other reason to really think through that, I think you'd have to have, I agree with some of the conversations that I think you'd have to have some institutional backing to provide both the resources. I mean, private equity spends a lot of money on consultants and getting smart, but also just to have the credibility with the market to say, hey, hold it, we've got the right strategy here, give us some time. I think would be, I could see it happening with some individuals, but I think ultimately you would need some institutional backing. So I'll pause there.
All right. So wonderful job further building out the ecosystem and helping us also, along with Yvonne's comments, thinking about the perspective of the management team and how much scrutiny is going to be helpful and when you might just have to scare off qualified people from the number of headaches that they're going to be facing. And with that, we're going to turn last but very far from least to Gabby Salzberger. She served on numerous public and private company boards. She is currently serving on the board of MasterCard, Eli Lilly, Brixmor Property Group, and the newly public Cerevel Therapeutics. In addition to her board work, she serves as a special advisor to Two Sigma and Centerbridge Partners. All right, Gabby, you've served on a whole variety of both public and private equity funded firms. And I was wondering if you could use the insights you've seen from both to think a little bit about what public company boards might already do well. I mean, part of what we're trying to do in moving from 2.0 to certain types of deficiencies. But given what you've seen of the differences, are there areas where you think the 2.0 model actually shines?
Yeah, well, I would say I agree with Les that I think under any scenario, these companies, the world's getting more complex, the companies are getting more complex. And so, under any scenario, 2.0 is evolving. But I do think that there are really, there are also some strengths, and I take some exception to some of the premise, in the article. I think if the assumption is that, in many cases, directors are not, really well informed, I think it's a different kind of quality of information. And so, yeah, it's true. I've been in activist situations where they come in with their, independent, reports and all that. But the ability to extract and work and develop a trusted relationship with the senior kind of management team is part of what, Yvonne is saying. Honestly, I can't think of a better source of quality information about what a company is actually dealing with. And so, I think that it is something that public company directors, it's kind of different. But I think that our sources of that information really are So I just take kind of exception to that as the model. And I also take exception to this idea that, the motivations are different. When you're on the public company board, you have all kinds of incentives, but in some ways, more importantly, you also have kind of this thing called reputational risk, so that there is a high level of motivation that's just kind of different, so, in the private equity, and I'm on 2 private equity boards now. Clearly it's just the motivation is different. And so I really think about that, differently, so I do in some ways take exception to some of the premise of the article. I think the other thing that I would really observe is that, as Yvonne said, part of the role is different. There isn't this whole compliance function. I think there is also different alignment that makes the role kind of so for example, a private equity director, he's getting on the board, and part of his job is like kind of figuring out what the exit's going to be like. If he's on this board more than 3 or 4 years, something's maybe not going right. So they have to think about, in order to really discharge their fiduciary responsibility, they're thinking about kind of a different time frame, and they're thinking about a more narrow set, in some respects, constituents. As a public company director, our terms are typically at least 5 years, 10 years, so much more closely aligned in a lot of ways with the rest of the management team and with longer term shareholders. And so it gives us the ability to do and think about some things like, I'll use another example, ESG. Private equity company boards, again, or directors, like their focus is more narrow. They're evaluated on the basis of, and have accountability that's a lot more limited. Whereas a public company director, we've got just broader accountability. So, let's use diversity, like the data around, private equity backed boards is not great, right? From a diversity perspective, it's their focus is more narrow, their accountability is more limited. And so, so their results have just been, really different on that dimension. So I think it's really complicated. And so I would say, I would say for sure, there are some practices that I've observed on my private equity boards that, I think that some of the ways they kind of can work outside of the boardroom can be highly effective. But I do think that there are ways that also kind of the roles are just fundamentally different. And, and so I'm a little more bullish on the public company board member. I think Les described him or her as 2.7.
All right. Well, I love that we've gotten through all the opening comments. We have limited time, but I do want to do a little bit of Q&A and maybe start right where Gabby ended. One of the big challenges that public companies are facing today, there's a number, but is the shift towards ESG and the increased focus from ESG. And that's, of course, coming through a variety of different mechanisms. It's coming through a variety of different jurisdictions. And I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts on how that relates or could inform both either the need for experimentation, some of the types of changes that Jeff and Ron have proposed, or whether or not actually we need a different type of evolution in order to allow boards to put more of a focus on concerns like sustainability, or are we already there? Les.
So I think that it's a great topic of conversation, which is to define what exactly is E, S, and G. And there's little unanimity or actually consensus on each of those elements to the acronym. But it highlights, I think, for me at least, the notion that we are talking about here, and that is the evolution of boards generally. And there are folks that are populating boards these days that have particular expertise in one leg of that stool or another in many instances that are additive to the discussion and the debate that's going on in the boardrooms. One of the things that happens historically is I think we over-rotate to the latest acronym of the day and tend to drive too much energy and focus on that at the expense of everything else. This is all one giant ecosystem, as Steve pointed out earlier, where all these pieces are interrelated. And so thinking about ESG is an important piece, but it's unique to each, it's bespoke effectively for every organization and enterprise. And yet there is a desire to overlay this generic view of what ESG is to satisfy some constituency or another. I'm not sure who that might be, but I do think that that is a topic that is consistently in the boardroom's forefront. It's consistently on the minds of directors, and it drives the director selection going forward into areas of broader specific expertise in one or another of those disciplines as part of a whole, not uniquely singular to just that one particular skill. So I'll stop there and leave it open for my other fellow panelists to pounce on my stupidity.
No,
Dan,
I'm just gonna add on to what Les said. I also think that ESG, like enterprise risk, as I was saying before, needs to get to be part of the DNA of basically everything you do. And so, I mean, I totally appreciate that the focus obviously then creates transparency around how you're doing on these things. But I would argue that well-run companies, it's not hard to think about these things. The difficulty is in exactly how you're measuring progress. And that's where the frameworks, I think, are trying to be helpful. But I would argue it's, you know, the part of it is getting it in the culture and the DNA so that it informs, you know, basically every decision that you're making.
I really like that point, and I like that you tied it back to the enterprise risk management and the culture and the DNA. It's interesting how often the examples today have involved banks. And of course, the New York Fed has had this long-running initiative to try to change the culture of banks. But I wonder if we want to tie that back in to some of the conversation earlier, that perhaps one of the challenges facing public company boards is the excessive focus on compliance. Steve suggested perhaps lawyers are playing too much of a role or encouraging too great of risk aversion. And that's one of the mechanisms through which is changing the ecosystem in these particular ways. But I wonder if we want to try to get back to that. We also got that from the earlier panel. I mean, I think Elizabeth Fontenay really highlighted that in her view, both Delaware law and federal law have been structured in ways that public company boards perhaps feel particular needs to be risk averse. So this isn't just kind of understanding risk in the positive way that Sandra pointed out, where you need to understand what you're exposed to, but also understand the upsides and use that to inform strategic decision making. But here it is kind of more of an almost CYA that consumes the attention. Do any of you have any thoughts? Like, is that a problem? Is that not a problem? And what can we do about it, particularly once we think it might be seeping into the DNA in particular ways?
Honestly, you know, I just haven't found it to be the problem that, you know, has been characterized in this way. And, you know, I've been on a bank board and, you know, highly regulated boards. And, you know, it is, as Sandra was saying earlier, that there's kind of some clear function that happens mostly at the committee level, you know, and so that the boards have, you know, we've kind of figured out how to kind of discharge that set of responsibilities. And yes, it does take time. It takes, you know, management support, but does it really kind of bog down the agenda of the board? It's just not been my experience. You know, it does take time. It mostly happens, in my experience, kind of committee level, well supported by management, and you know, and it's very important. So,
And I would just add to Gabby's comment a little bit, which is just that I think all of these legislations and regulations all emerged for very good reasons, and they force a public company to focus on some areas. So I think the intention is good, and it does create some positive focus. The hard part is when, you know, there are very specific things where, you know, if a company is trying to check the box and get all greens, because the boxes are all set for every company, if you just did that, you might end up doing the wrong thing for the company. And so you just need to have a board, set of board members and a set of management team members who are going to be thoughtful enough to say, okay, our goal is not to get a perfect score on ISS and Glass Lewis. Like if our goal in life was to make them perfectly happy, we probably wouldn't be compensating the management team correctly. And so how do we thread the needle to do the right thing for the company and make sure that we, attract and retain and reward our executives in aligned incentives, but also try to not, be terrible on ISS and Glass Lewis. And so, and it's good that they exist because it forces you to think about that. But I think it's just, you need to have the board members and the management team who are going to be willing to do the work to try to find the right balance.
So that was a great comment. It ties together a number of the comments that we have, that trying to think about these things as board 2.0 or board 3.0 is really missing the incredible, not just heterogeneity among companies, but heterogeneity among boards, among different functions within the boards, the way the boards structure their time. And one of the points that a number of you made is you keep coming back to, like, you have to look at who the people are. I mean, Steve was listing off, like, when you have these 5 people in a room, like, you don't have to worry quite as much about all of the other issues, because that's going to play a really big role. Oh, one of the things that's really remarkable about this particular group is so many of you have served on a number of different boards. And one of the concerns with that at times is people are attention constrained, so they aren't able to dive as deep. On the other hand, there clearly can be insights that you garner from one area that help you bring a different perspective, perhaps, to some of your other board roles. And I wonder if any of you want to comment on what you see as the advantages or perhaps drawbacks of serving on multiple different boards or on private equity public boards.
So I venture to say, Kate, that if we keep in mind what our role is, which is an oversight role, right? We're not there to manage. We're there to oversee and to assess the effectiveness of the management team in executing an agreed upon strategy, and to either compensate or not compensate for the achievement or lack of achievement of that strategy, I think it's important to recognize that we operate in each individual company in a unique ecosystem that is singular to that enterprise. Maybe more common elements within its industry, but certainly to each enterprise, it's unique. And we're driven to bring perspectives that can inform the thinking of management in developing and articulating the strategy that it presents. So I think there's a benefit to having that diversity of experience. It's the same reason why, certainly at the public company level, many managements encourage their executives to, at a certain level, to at least have one other board position, one outside board position, to help inform their thinking about how they do their business. So it may be more prevalent in the private equity space, because you tend to have different kinds of boards in the PE space than you do in the public company space, in terms of the backgrounds of the directors. But in either instance, I think having that diversity and breadth of perspective helps to make for better decision making.
And can I just add something about this? It's like exercise, right? The more you do, the better your muscle structure is.
Not true in my case, Sandra, but I'll take your word for it.
You can overdo it and get injured, and then you're out of, then you're not effective. But I believe that there's a lot of value that comes from crossing industries and having the depth of experience. And I think maybe you raised it, if you've been through crises, you never get rid of that wound. So it is still pretty fresh, and you call upon that to help get the company through a crisis if they're in one.
I agree with Sandra and Les. And just like with anything else, you have to learn how to be a good board member, right? Because it's a very different role than being a day-to-day operator, and it's a very different role than being an investor. And so there's a learning curve, and having different experiences in different settings will help you become a better board member.
All right. Well, this has been an absolutely wonderful session. Before we turn it back over to Ron and Jeff to give a few responses, I want to open it up to each of the panelists, if they want, to just share one or two closing comments or closing thoughts on today's conversation. So we'll go back through the same order that we started with. Les, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think important to remember at the end of the day is that we're living in a world of constant and high velocity change, and that board roles and board composition and the skills and talents necessary to help inform the movement of that agenda evolves quickly over time, and that there is no stasis in this community. So I think these kinds of conversations are very helpful, but I don't think that there is a destination to this. It is a journey that is endless.
Eve?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. First, on the issue that Les raised initially, and then Ed Rock talked about, which is the thickness of information that the hedge funds sometimes create, and that's absolutely true with respect to the sophisticated hedge funds. That for a while was a concern of management's. They would not want a representative from one of the sophisticated hedge funds on their board, because they would say they're developing information themselves, and they have an advantage over all of the other directors. The suggestion that I made that was adopted by a company that I was representing was that they ask that these hedge funds make that information available to all the directors, thereby putting everybody on equal footing and taking advantage of the richness of information that these very sophisticated investors can put out. And I think that that is a way of dealing with that. Secondly, at the risk of being at least slightly contrarian, I would say that there's a significant initiative these days to developing more diverse boards, and I think that that's all to the good. And one of the, I think, unintended side effects of the increased diversity of boards is that people are getting on boards who were not directors before. It used to be that in doing a search for board members, one of the important criteria was where else are they on boards? Do they have board experience? That's really hard to do if you are really convinced that you've got to have a diverse board. So we're seeing a lot more first-time directors, and my observation is that often these people bring a perspective that is very useful, and their lack of experience as board members is sometimes a real plus.
Right, Sandra?
I'll take it very back to the first thing that Les said, which was his experience with private equity boards is that they're collegiate, collaborative, and directive. And I believe that that can exist as well on a public company board. And so not to make it all touchy-feely, but I do believe that refreshing boards on a regular basis, having a really good mindfulness about the composition of the board as well as that culture. Many people who serve on boards are operating partners at PE firms. And we haven't talked about that at all, but I think that a lot of the things that come from PE have already started to migrate onto public company boards. Part of it is that engaged and proactive, constructive conflict culture. Some of it is the digging deep. Some of it is a sense of urgency and deal acumen. So I think that, I agree with the beginning premise, which is a lot of boards are already at 2.75. And so I do think this is a journey, and I think many companies could use more 3.0 thinking, but there already are lots of examples where it's already on that journey.
Right, Ed Rock?
I'm here. Comments really directed for Jeff and Ron. I think this has been a terrific panel that has convinced me that that the board 2.0 model that Mel Eisenberg argued for in 1976 and that was accepted so widely has evolved, as have companies, so that we really are today at something like 2.75. And in trying to do what Mel did so well in his book, which is to kind of crystallize a new view or a view of a particular concept of the board, in Mel's case, the monitoring board, that a service that Ron and Jeff can do on the way to that is to collect a variety of cases or case studies, or have students go off and do case studies of really great practices that instantiate this thickly resourced, thickly informed model of a director that they're pushing for. So even just on this panel and previous panel, we've seen a variety of examples. We've seen the pipe example. We've seen the ex-PE firms, PE firms that go public with the PE firm staying on the board for a number of years. The de-SPAC company and Validation Capital. I think each of those would be worthy of a chapter in the book that they would write about new models or effective models of thickly informed, well-resourced directors contributing both to the value of the company as well as to the credibility of the company in the marketplace.
All right, Yvonne.
No, thanks so much. I echo a lot of what's been said. I think there are strengths and also, kind of drawbacks to the public company model, and certainly strengths and drawbacks to the private equity model. So the key is to have these conversations and learn from each other. So thank you so much. And unfortunately, I have to drop off, but it's been so wonderful chatting with all of you and debating on this important topic. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to chime in quickly?
Just very quickly, I mean, maybe one practical thing. In PE firms, often the lead deal partner is effectively the chairman. I think looking at the chairman role and making it a real job, and already they're splitting the job between the CEO and the chairman, but not to run the company, but to make the board more effective in a public company setting, making sure those board members do have things that they're doing and are informed. I think that can be a very valuable, I guess, lesson from PE, though I think their public companies are learning it on their own.
And I like that's been one of the themes, is trying to figure out not an entire model, but particular pieces that poured over well. And with that, Gabby?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's actually what I was gonna say, is I challenged by the notion that the model ports, but that there are clearly pieces of it, as there are pieces from other kind of areas that, I think as public company boards, there are any number of opportunities for us to get better. And at the end of the day, like, we're a team, right? And so the way we think about our senior executive teams, it's this kind of the combination of the strength of individuals as well as the dynamic of the group, that ultimately is what allows us to be effective. So, and there's always opportunity to grow and get better.
There is for all of us. All right, I cannot thank our panelists enough. A huge amount from this conversation. Thank you to Ron and Jeff for starting it off. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, for running such a great session, and Wei as well. There's certainly a lot to reflect upon. Ed's invitation to write a book is there's a dawning suggestion. But what Les said is that, in a sense, maybe we already have we already have board 2.75. Provocative thought. And in a sense, the claim that there are already new style directors on boards, many of them ported over from PE themselves, perhaps retired partners at those firms. That would be an interesting empirical piece to follow up on, I suppose. The one thing that I thought the panel kind of danced around is the implication to be drawn from the frequency of activist challenges and the success of them, which I think have to be taken as a reproof to board models, at least at many firms. So first of all, I think Ed's example of the validation role that Tryon may play, in a sense, is our version of relational investor. And the question that maybe will be reflected upon later is the extent to which that could become a more general approach and not just limited to just a few hedge funds who've made a business of it. But secondly, in the sense of, the success of the present board model as conceived of, for me anyway, the fact that the activists are so successful does suggest an issue here, because it's got to be the case that the institutional investors are not persuaded that the boards of these firms are delivering a credible defense of the management strategy. And so in a way that kind of motivates, at least for me, part of the push to think that, at least for some firms, there would be value in sketching out, in perhaps overly dramatic ways, an alternative board model that could give them the resources to deal with this new world. So I'll stop at that. And Ron.
I'm going to say something quickly that out of character draws on experience rather than academic experience. The comment about the board chair, the last comment about the board chair, I think was enormously powerful. We have, and if we expect the board to work, and particularly if we're going to require, we're going to provide the board resources and the things that we think a board needs to be effective, there needs to be leadership on the board. And the conversations about having an independent chair, I lived through that fuss with the 40 Act, tends to miss that, because it's not that you're interfering in operating the company, it's you're making effective the role of the board. And I'll just leave one circumstance that I think for me now warrants even more attention. How does a CEO communicate with the board? The CEO can call everybody on the board, but if you add niceties, that's a chunk of the CEO's time that probably could be done more effectively. The CEO could write a memo. Well, that's going to go through the general counsel's office, and what's going to come out of it is going to be radically more constrained than anything else. What my experience has been is that the CEO can call me. And my job is making sure that the board stays fully informed, because being able to do that increases the incentives to provide the information. The reason I mention it is only because I think I used the term engineering to describe the board, to describe this exercise. And it is engineering in the sense that we're taking pieces of things that put them together, but it also underscores the fact that the whole discussion, including the board 3.0 characterization, is an exercise in demonstrating that one size doesn't fit all, that industries are different, time frames are different, and circumstances are different, and that framing what the board needs is a different question than the engineering of how do you provide those things to different boards with different histories, with different characteristics. And it's been the panels have just been terrific at making that point.
Okay, so maybe that's a good final word. I sort of wonder if I haven't had a chance to look at audience questions, and we're now kind of getting a little bit. Let me just ask one that maybe the panel could respond to. Just a way of kind of bringing some folks in here. What's the trade-off between becoming, in effect, a thickly informed, fully engaged director, and then becoming an insider? So if there's an irreducible element of monitoring involved in the role of being a director, which is to say willingness to dismiss perhaps the CEO, to what extent is that in tension with a director who becomes, in effect, part of the inside group, even while starting from the outside, nevertheless develops a strong commitment to the strategy as being implemented? Does that person lose the capacity to be a monitor? So that was a question from the audience, and I wonder if maybe some of the directors on panel 2 might say a word about that. Do we have any directors on panel 2? Or Sandra, I see you sort of like you have to unmute.
I might be the only one still here, and I'm just
Okay.
barely still here. So
Okay, all right.
I'll be brief. No, I don't think it creates a conflict, but it does require one to be what do they call it? Eyes on, but hands off a little bit. I think being thickly informed makes you more effective from the perspective of the quality of the questions that you ask in your monitoring capacity. You obviously have to avoid useless meddling, but being thickly informed allows you to act more quickly when you need to.
Okay.
Jeff, let me jump in. Jeff, let me jump in on there for a second. That's the classic argument about the problem with the Arthur Goldberg fully staffed board concept that Mel talks about in his book, is that for an outside director, the worry is you either become an insider, in which case we already have an executive team, or you become a alternative center of power, in which case it becomes unclear who's running the show. What's interesting, of course, is that when Warren Buffett goes on the board when he owns 15% of a company, nobody asks whether there's a danger that Warren Buffett is going to become an insider. There may be a danger that he'll meddle, but there's no danger that he'll be an insider because he has such a large investment stake that you're confident that he's going to think about this primarily as an investor and not, however cordial his relationship with the management becomes, not get captured in the sense that you worry about with respect to an outside director, potentially, who becomes that involved with the corporation.
Yeah, Jeff, my personal experience is that I was recently on the board of a relatively large public company. I was indeed thickly informed about that company, and that level of information permitted me to, in fact, get the CEO to be replaced because I understood what the failings were, what the problems were, and I actually think that information is an advantage and not a taint.
Okay, that's a positive note on which to end. Okay, well, look, this has been really a great gift to Ron and me as we try to think through this idea and develop it further, and maybe push forward with it. I mean, as I think Ron said at the very, the metaphor we came up with in a certain way is board 3.0 is there's no objective here to try to impose yet another one-size-fits-all scheme on a particular model, right? So the point of board 3.0 is to inject optionality to the current board model. What we've heard is that there already is some of that on today's boards. Maybe it's not been described in quite that way. It would be of value to demonstrate some of the optionality that's already emerged, and in that way encourage more experimentation, because as we started with, part of the point here is to avoid the sense that in order to migrate to first best governance, in order to achieve to first best governance, firms would have to migrate to a private market space rather than remain as a public firm. And for those who are committed to sort of financial inclusion, being flexible enough in governance arrangements to hold firms in the public market space, I think serves that broad goal. So anyway, thanks very much. These panel sessions will be recorded and available on the Millstein Center website and perhaps others, as a resource. And there's already been of great value, I think, in our collective discussion. We had a sign up of 600 at various times. The participants were 250, and folks come in and out as you've already been veterans of Zoom. So I think we've collectively added to the global discussion on these issues, and can appreciate all who were involved in that. So thanks very much. Enjoy your afternoons.